Okay, first we want to grab a V block, which is one of these, and then grab your blank. Set the bandsaw to the correct height, which is just above your stock material. Then I run it corner to corner on the bandsaw, making sure just to barely nick it. So that way it leaves a mark from corner to corner. This will help us find our center. Now on a non-square piece, like how this one is really rectangular, you'll notice how it doesn't actually put it in the center. Here's another way we can find the center of a non-square piece. If you take a straight edge, like a square, or even another straight jointed piece of wood, you can also mark it from corner to corner using a pencil. I also like to make my piece more of an octagon than just a square, because it's really hard to take off those big corners on the lathe. Okay, now if you need to remove whatever chuck is on there, use that metal slot to hold it in place while you twist the other end with that giant silver wheel on the left side. Now if you hold that silver wheel, you can also spin on your new chuck or your jaws. In this case, we're going to be using jaws. Lift up the pole in the middle to loosen the live center on the right. Slide it in and do the same for the tool rest. So first, we want to put one of our ends in and tighten it just so that it stays in place, not very tight. You'll see why in just a second. Tighten the live center by pushing it forward or backward. Use this spinning wheel to get it close to center. Once it's pretty close, we're going to make sure that our blank is just loose enough that we can move it a tiny bit. Here's an example of when I lined up my piece. It wasn't quite in the center, so that's why we want to leave it just a little loose. Okay, now I'm going to spin my block around so I can figure out where to put my tool rest. I don't want it to hit, but I do want it almost as close as possible, usually around an 1/8 or even a 1/16 of an inch. This is a pretty good amount. Also be sure to spin your block to make sure it's not going to hit the tool rest. Ask me how I know. Now to set the height. When we're setting it, we want the blade of our tool to be right on the center. That's why I like marking my X's with the bandsaw, is so I can make one of the lines level, and that will help me find out where I need to put my tool rest. Okay, now that we've got that all set up, we're going to tighten everything and then twist this dial to the left. When we turn our lathe on, it should read 0 since we spun it counterclockwise. Once we spin it clockwise, it'll start turning. Again, this is why you want to check that your blank is not going to hit your tool rest multiple times. Push the red button to stop the lathe. Here's a good chart to show us. We're about 2 inches, so we should be somewhere between 760 and 1500 RPMs for our first rough cut. Now this is a real-time cutting. I'm going really slow into this first piece of wood. Obviously, even though our wood is an octagon, it's not exactly on center. So we need to help it so it can be turned round. That's our first goal. You should be able to hear this, what it sounds like. Could you tell the difference once it was turned round? Now notice here, I'm turning with only one hand. It's really your backhand, which for most people is your right, that is doing all the work. The left hand is just to stabilize it. If I run my finger over the top, it should feel smooth. This is how I know it's round. Now I'm going to mark where the top of the hat is, and also where the bottom of the ornament is. Again, now that we're starting to cut, I'm going to be somewhere between 1000 to 1600 RPMs. Now you don't need to turn it exactly how fast it says. In this case, I ended up going just a little bit slower because the lathe started shaking around 1200 RPMs. Now I take a pencil and I'm going to mark out where each of the main sections are: the hat the head and the body. Look at this up arrow. You should be able to see me taking away a bunch of material. And I like to scoop this round tool side to side to really get the best angle on it. Again, this is me carving out the head, just somewhat of a round shape. A lot of this is going to take practice. Kind of like riding a bike. It might look a little rough the first couple times you do it. But here's our hat, and here's our body with the 2 circles. That's kind of roughed out. So now that I've got my rough shape, I'm going to just clean it up a little bit and try to get it exactly how I want. Okay, I've got it exactly how I want. I've done all the shaping, and now I'm going to get ready for sanding. I'm going to move my tool rest, and when I turn my lathe on, I can actually bump up the RPMs. So right now, if we look at our finished RPMs, we're somewhere between 1600 to maybe 2500. So now with the tool rest out of the way, we can use our sandpaper to hold it against our project. Again, just like anything else, you might want to start around 120 and then work up to 150 and maybe 180. After you're done sanding, you can apply a coat of lacquer or some type of oil to make it really shiny. In this case, it was just a practice piece. That's why I didn't end up finishing it. So now loosen the live center and take your project out of the jaws. Now I'm going to go back to the bandsaw to cut the top off of his hat. It's a little sketchy trying to cut off his hat while we're on the lathe. So instead I'm going to do it on the bandsaw. But see how shaky this round part is? That's why I'm using this V block, and I have that octagon or square to really hold it steady when I cut it. So I cut it off pretty close to the top of his hat. We're going to get rid of this later by sanding it. Now for the bottom part. Same idea here. I want to support the snowman up on the V-block as much as possible and run this through just slow enough that I can cut a straight line. Now when I go over to the wide belt sander, notice how brown that is. You can definitely get some smoke going if you're on the sander for too long. So be sure to ease it off every once in a while. Now that's one way to do it. You can leave him flat on the bottom so that he stands right on a table. Using that V-block really helps me to get a consistent round shape on the bottom. Now if you haven't used an air tool before, you have to pull the section down, shove in whatever air tool you're using, in this case a sander, and then a lot of times you have to push it back up to lock it into place, and you'll hear the sander. So all I'm really doing here is holding the sander steady and then rubbing the snowman up against the palm sander in my hand. Then I'm also doing the bottom portion of it to get rid of those burn marks. But hey, what a cute guy. I know he's not perfect, so give yourself a little slack, but you can feel free to draw on some eyes, some nose, or some buttons too if you want.